Thank you guys for having me today. I want to thank Anthony Vaca for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be at the Hoover Public Library. I want to thank everyone involved with the library for having me. It's always an honor to get to talk about writing and talk about my books. I tell folks I never get tired of it. It's like talking about your kids, and so it's always fun for me. I do probably the most fun I have at events like this is answering questions. So feel free to ask it. Any question that you have when it comes to your mind, I'll repeat it and then try to answer it as best I can. My name's Robert Bailey, and I've written four legal thrillers, very much in the Grisham sense. My first novel, which came out in 2014, is called The Professor, and The Professor introduces the character of Tom McMurtry. Tom is a legendary law professor at the University of Alabama School of Law in Tuscaloosa. He's 68 years old when you meet him, and he is a former football player for Coach Paul Bear Bryant. Tom played on the 1961 national championship team. Now, Tom's completely a fictional character, but he was obviously on a real team. And so one of the fun things you can do in fiction is you just make stuff up as you go. And I wanted my professor character to be a living legend. And one of the easiest ways to do that in the state of Alabama is to put him on one of Coach Bryant's teams. And so that's what I did. And the professor makes a choice when he's a young man to come back to the law school. He's asked by Coach Bryant to come back to the law school to run the trial advocacy program and teach evidence. And very much, if you're familiar at all with Alabama football, very much an ode to the Coach Bryant story when he was asked to come home to Mama and be Alabama's coach in the late 50s. In my story, instead of Mama calling, Coach Bryant calls Tom home. And so the first scene in the book is that scene where Coach Bryant asked Tom to come back, and then you flash forward 40 years and you see Tom as this legendary law professor. Now, Tom is in the twilight of his career. He's got a administration that's very much looking for new blood, and he's starting to have some health problems. And all the while, there's this awful trucking accident that affects one of Tom's oldest friends, and it's a tragedy, and several people die. And this woman comes to Tom and asks him for help. And Tom, thinking that he is just not the person for the job given his health problems, refers the case to a young lawyer named Rick Drake. Rick Drake is very much based on a young me. You see, when I started writing these books, I was a young lawyer. I'm not a young lawyer anymore, but I was when I started. And Rick takes the case. He gets in way over his head, as any young lawyer would be, regardless of talent. There are bad guys in the story. The primary bad guy, the primary villain, is this ruthless trucking owner named Jack Willistone. And eventually, Rick is mature enough to realize that he needs help with the case, and he asks the professor to try the case with him. The story is very much a redemption story. And so the professor spawned a series, the McMurtry and Drake series, and the second book in the series is called Between Black and White. And in the professor, you meet the character of Bo Cephas Haynes for the first time. Bo Cephas Haynes is an African-American lawyer from Pulaski, Tennessee, who when he was 5 years old watched 10 members of the Ku Klux Klan murder his father. And that event has shaped his whole life. And while you get a little of his history in The Professor, you get all of it in Between Black and White. Bo's best friend in the world is Tom McMurtry, and at the beginning of the book, he is charged with the murder of the man he has always felt was the leader of the lynch mob that killed his father. And so when Bo gets in that kind of trouble, there's only one person he would call, and that's Tom. And so Tom and Rick go to Pulaski, Tennessee to represent Bo Cephas Haynes in this race-related murder mystery, which is sort of, have any of you guys read A Time to Kill by John Grisham? A Time to Kill was probably my favorite of the Grisham books, and Between Black and White is kind of my ode to A Time to Kill, although it's a much different story because 2012 Pulaski, Tennessee is much different the 1985 Clanton, Mississippi. And so it's got a different nuance to it, but there are some similarities. And certainly, as a Grisham fan, that book was fun to write. The third book is The Last Trial, which picks up about 9 months after the events of Between Black and White. One of the characters says early on in The Last Trial that nothing's been the same since Pulaski. Some of the health problems that has dogged Tom and the professor start to come back in The Last Trial. And he's visited sort of by a ghost from his past in that story. And I know a lot of you probably haven't read any of my books. I don't want to provide any spoilers. And so I'll just say that there's a character from the professor that comes back in The Last Trial and has a big role in it, and she gets in a lot of trouble, and Tom represents her in what he knows is likely to be his last trial. He takes the case, and he gets a lot of help from Bo and some help from Rick in that one. And then the book that I'm kind of in the midst of a book tour, sort of winding down, it came out in April, is The Final Reckoning. This is the last book in the McMurtry and Drake series. It sort of ties up all the loose ends to the series. The series villain is this contract killer named Jim Bone Wheeler, and in The Last Trial he promises that if he ever gets out of prison, he's going to bring a reckoning on Tom and everyone Tom holds dear. And in this story, he does get out of prison, and he tries to fulfill his promise. And this story is very much a shoot 'em up, so to speak, and I'm real proud of it, the way it turned out. And although it does end this series, it does sort of leave room to grow for some of the other characters. And I'll talk about this later, but I've got a book that's going to come out next April that's going to be kind of a spin-off of this series that takes Bocephus Haynes and goes forward with his storyline some. But that's just kind of a snapshot of my books. I know that a lot of you probably kind of want to know how in the world all this happened. It's a long story. I've always loved to, well, first of all, I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer in Huntsville, and I've been a lawyer for 20 years. I'm still a lawyer, and so I've written sort of as a side job. I started out as a hobby, and now it's definitely a full-time job. And so I've got 2 full-time jobs now, which is difficult to balance and requires time management and a lot of luck, to be honest with you. But it's really fun, and both careers balance each other out a lot. There's a lot of synergy between them because as a trial lawyer, what you do is you tell stories to juries, and your witnesses are your characters, and a lot of times the lawyer that tells the best story is the lawyer that wins the case. And so I've found that being a writer has helped me as a lawyer and vice versa. But when I was growing up, it took me a long time to learn how to read. You know, back when I was a kid, we learned how to read in the 1st grade. Now kids learn how to read when they're 3 or 4 years old. But 1st grade was hard for me, and when I finally got it, you know, when the light bulb finally went on, I really enjoyed reading, and remember the first few books I read, the Bobbsey Twins. Anybody read the Bobbsey Twins books? Bobbsey Twins in the Country? Just old school books about these kids growing up, and really enjoyed those, and that begat Beverly Cleary and Judy Blume, Encyclopedia Brown, and then you read all the classics in high school like Steinbeck, and of course in this state, you know, the book that everybody reads is To Kill a Mockingbird, which I remember reading To Kill a Mockingbird. I remember where I read it in my house, and for me, you know, that story probably inspired me to be both a lawyer and a writer. I think every lawyer in the state of Alabama, deep down, really wants to be Atticus Finch. And so it's such a wonderful story. But around that same time that I read To Kill a Mockingbird, there's this lawyer in Mississippi that starts writing these books. And, you know, John Grisham's first book and my favorite book was A Time to Kill, but the one that made him a star was The Firm. And The Firm came out, and you know, I read it and just gobbled up his first 5 novels. I really enjoyed them, and again, really kind of inspired me to want to be a lawyer, but also to think about writing. I didn't really get serious about the writing process until I was in college. I was a senior at Davidson in North Carolina, and I had an elective I needed to take that last semester, and they offered a creative writing class. And so I took it, and it was taught by an author that I can't even remember his name right now, but it was kind of a traveling professor gig. We had 8 students in the class, and we wrote short stories. And I wrote 4 short stories, which were terrible. They weren't very good. They were very unsophisticated, written by someone who hadn't experienced very much of life. But I really, really enjoyed it, and I got enough good comments to think that maybe I had some talent for it. And I went to law school at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And I remember sitting in class one day daydreaming about what would happen if my law professor actually had to try a case. And it was a very smart aleck idea at the time. But it was the kind of idea that sort of sticks with you. And it did stick with me, and the idea started to become larger. What would happen? And what about if this law professor was a legend? What if he played for Coach Bryant? What if he taught for 40 years? What if he wrote the book on evidence in the state of Alabama? And all of a sudden, the character of Tom McMurtry started to take shape in my mind. And so I came to Huntsville, and after my first year out practicing law, I sat down and I wrote the prologue to the professor. And I showed it to my wife, who, God bless her, Dixie's read every word I've ever written. And thankfully, I feel like I've gotten better over the years, but the first few drafts were pretty rough. But she thought that there was something there. And so I sat down and wrote the professor. And I'll tell this to every prospective writer that I ever talk to, and I think it's the truth. And I think the 2 most important words for every aspiring writer are the end. Because if you don't get to the end, you will never, ever write a story. You'll never write a novel. You'll never write a short story. You'll never finish a book. You've got to get to the end. And I reached the end on the first draft of The Professor after 2 years and 850 pages. And what I thought I had was really just about the best book that was ever written. And so I thought, I'm going to get published with this 850-page monster. And so I started thinking about how I was going to do that, and got the reference books about how to do that. And I'm glad to share what those are in a minute. But make a long story short, I sent query letters out to 6 literary agents. I sent one out to Nicholas Sparks' agent, and to Brad Meltzer's agent, and to John Sanford's agent. I sent 6 emails out. Went to get a cup of coffee. Was really feeling good about myself, chasing the dream, right? Got back, sat down. Within less than a minute, had 6 rejection emails. And what I quickly learned is that nobody's going to buy an 850-page book from a debut author. It's just not going to happen. And not only are they not going to do that, but legal thrillers aren't 850 pages. Unless your name's Greg Iles and you've published about 6 or 7 masterpieces, and then you can publish whatever you want. And I've read a few of his 800-page books, and they're fantastic. And I love 800-page books. I'm a Stephen King fan. So, it was very discouraging to get, that kind of a rejection. I was like, what am I going to do? My book's too long. And I felt pretty naive and stupid for even trying to get published at that point. But you have to be pretty stubborn to get to the finish line. And so I went back, and while I was thinking about writing The Professor, and while I was writing it, this other idea popped into my mind, the idea for Between Black and White, of this African-American lawyer in Pulaski who, when he's 5 years old, he witnesses the brutal murder of his father by the Ku Klux Klan. And so I started writing this book. And, John Grisham talks about how when he finished writing A Time to Kill, he immediately started writing The Firm. And when he finished The Firm, he started writing The Pelican Brief. And I think, one of the most important things you got to do as a writer is to write and keep writing. And so I finished between black and white. It was the hardest thing I've ever done because I reached page 500 and I wasn't close to the end yet, and I knew I wasn't going to get it published where I had it. But I finished it, and it was 650 pages. So, you know, I'm getting a little better, but it's still no chance of being published. But along the way, I figured out how to fix the professor. And the way I did that is I put Bo Cephas Haynes in the professor, because if you can believe it, in all 850 pages of that first draft, Bo was not in the story. And so I went back to the professor. I really thought that book was in better shape. And I figured out that my theme of that story, what it was all going to be about, was Tom McMurtry's redemption. Because when I first wrote the book, I identified more with the Rick Drake character, because he was the young guy making all the mistakes and, you know, doing all the lawyer things. And I had a lot of chapters about Rick thinking, you know. And the worst thing you can do as a writer is to bore your readers. And while a lawyer thinking about his case is pretty exciting to me as a lawyer, it wasn't very exciting to my wife or anybody else that I had read it early on. And so I cut a lot of the storyline that didn't have anything to do with Tom's redemption, and what I ended up with was a 450-page book. And so I went back to those same 6 agents, and I sent a query letter to them, and 3 of them asked to read the book. And so I knew at that point that I was in the wheelhouse of doing something right. And but along the way, you know, you talk about what is the Outliers book, about the 10,000 hours? Somewhere in all that, I got my 10,000 hours in. And I really learned how to write by making a bunch of mistakes. And we went out to agents. The first thing you have to do if you want to get published by a real publisher is to get a literary agent. And I sent query letters out to 100 agents. 30 of them asked to read the book. The publishing business is not like the legal business. I'll tell you a story. I was at a book signing for my published novel at a bookstore, and I got an email from an agent that I queried 3 years earlier saying that they were too busy and didn't have time to read my book. But you don't get callbacks in 24 hours, and it's a very frustrating business, and you hear the word no a whole lot, and we heard no a whole lot. But eventually, after 8 months, I got an offer of representation. I actually got 2 offers. I got an offer from an agent with a big agency, and I got an offer from a smaller agency that was just starting up. So what did I do? I went with the big agent, right? And she wanted me to make a bunch of changes to the novel, which I thought sounded like they made sense. So I did. And after 4 months, I sent the book back to her. And she said, "You did exactly what I wanted you to do, but I've now decided that I only want to represent cookbooks." So I went back to the other agent and said, "Look, I've made a terrible mistake. And is there any way that, you know, you can help me out? This grave I've dug for myself." And she said yes, and she was very excited about it. And you know, one of the things that you remember along the journey is the people that really get excited about your work. And Liza Fleisig is my agent, and she was really excited about it, and she threw out the changes I made with the old agent because she didn't like them. And we went back to the drawing board of what I'd sent her to begin with, and we trimmed it up, we edited it, and we went back out. And we went with publishers for the first time. And so, you know, to be published, you have to have publishers read your book. And the way that happens is literary agents who are familiar with editors send their own query letters, their own emails, their own phone calls to those folks. And the way you get in the door is that agent gets you in the door. And, you know, getting in the door stays open. They read it, and then they may shut the door on you, and that happens a whole lot. We got read by a lot of big editors, and you know, Liza did a great job, but unfortunately, we kept hearing the word no. Have you guys read the book The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold? It's a great book, really good book. The editor for that book really liked the professor, and Little Brown took it under advisement. I guess we made the boardroom where you When an editor likes it, tries to talk to the other editors about it, they vote on it. They voted no. But I was excited nonetheless, because it was, this was living the dream for me. But we hadn't gotten there yet. And Eliza, about 6 months in, says, what we really need is somebody that everybody knows to say something nice about your book. What we really need is a blurb from another author. And so I said, okay, I'll try to get one. And little did I know how almost impossible it is to get a blurb from another author at all, much less if you're unpublished and never been published before. But I didn't know that at the time and went out and had fun with it and sent emails, left messages for all my heroes. Craig Johnson, who writes the Longmire series, Brad Meltzer, John Sanford, Michael Connolly, John Grisham, Stephen King, Dean Koontz. I sent messages to all these guys, and all of them said no. But they were really nice about it. And one thing about the publishing business and other writers is most writers are pretty nice, and they're not really rooting against you. Most of them are rooting for you. But they had stacks of published books to read, and I was an unpublished writer. There was one person that said yes. Winston Groom in Fairhope, Alabama, who wrote Forrest Gump, said yes, said he'd love to look at it. And I sent it to him, and he gave me the blurb that dons the cover of The Professor. It always makes me think that you just never know what somebody's going to do for you unless you ask them. And Winston Groom, who did not know me from Adam, who I'd never spoken to before, did something incredibly nice for me, and I'll always be grateful. That was a huge break, and another break that I got didn't seem like a break at the time. I got two big breaks. The Winston Groom blurb was one. The other one was I got an editor who said no, but most of these editors say no, and it's very much like dating. It's kind of it's not you, it's me. It just makes you feel terrible, and it's a very general, vague rejection. But this editor said no and gave me some specific reasons why he said no, and said he would be willing to read it again if I made these changes. And so I looked at what he said, and my first gut reaction was I was really mad about it because I had worked really hard to get to where I was, and I didn't want to change anything. But after I calmed down a little bit, I realized that some of those suggestions were probably things I should do. One of them was the book is a Southern book. You need to own it. You need to wrap yourself up in it. You don't need to try to make it something that it's not. If you can sweeten the tea, so to speak, you should sweeten the tea. And so that was really freeing for me because the tea was real sweet to begin with, and I had unsweetened it a lot, and so I got to put it back to where it was. The other thing that was super hard was you need to cut 50 pages. I don't care how you do it. That was really hard because at that point you're killing your darlings. And, I didn't want to kill my darlings, but I did want to get published. And so I went back, and there's this great crawfish eating contest scene in The Professor, if you've read that book, that was much longer and had a lot of comic relief that I still miss when I look back at the story, but I cut it because it needed to be cut, and it made the book better. He gave some other advice about how my villain needed to have more motivation for doing the evil things that he did. And so for 30 days I made those edits, and we sent the book back. And he, of course, said no. He said, you did exactly what I wanted you to do, but we still can't take it. We just don't have room for this kind of book. But in the very next round of submissions, when we went out again, we got an offer. And so it always makes me think of two things. What would have happened if we'd started with that version? And then the other thing I think about is just how eternally grateful I am for getting the advice that came when it did. And so we got an offer from a UK publisher called Angry Robot for an imprint that they just opened called Exhibit A Books, and they were going to publish my book. And by that point, I didn't care who it was. I just wanted somebody to publish it. I wanted to have a book. I wanted to be able to open it and smell it and, have that feeling of accomplishment. And so we got that, and it was very much a fist pump moment for me. It was exciting. And they bought The Professor, and they wanted a sequel. And I had a sequel already in place called Between Black and White, so I felt like we were on the right track. And what ended up happening is the imprint that they were trying to open pretty much didn't work. None of the other books in it really sold that many copies, but The Professor was doing pretty good. And what happened is the imprint closed, and Exhibit A decided they were not going to publish my second book. But Angry Robot said, well, we'll just keep publishing The Professor because it's selling. And they started selling it for next to nothing, like 99 cents on Amazon. And the darndest thing started happening. People really started buying it. And for Angry Robot, it was free money. For me, it was lots of exposure because all of a sudden, my book's on the top of the Amazon bestseller list. And this was back when, y'all remember Gone Girl? Remember the story Gone Girl? That was the it book of 2014, I think. Anyway, I've got this picture of The Professor 1 and Gone Girl 2. And so, that helped me out a lot. And all of a sudden, I got a message on Goodreads. Are any of y'all members of Goodreads? Goodreads is a neat online interactive place for readers to go and find book suggestions, and just a good place for authors to develop a readership too. But got a message from the managing editor of Thomas & Mercer, which is Amazon's thriller and mystery imprint, and he said that they were interested in The Professor. And about a month later, I had a new publishing contract with Thomas & Mercer to publish The Professor and Between Black and White. And so they republished The Professor with a new cover, and they decided they wanted Between Black and White, and that is kind of my story from beginning to end. Since signing that contract, I've now put 4 books out with Thomas & Mercer, and I have a 5th one that's coming out next April, and been very fortunate to land with them. When they came out with their first few books, it was a big gamble because a lot of folks weren't sure how Thomas & Mercer books were going to do, because Amazon, is a big bookstore, but it's also its own, publisher. And so they publish their own books, and they have 5 or 6 imprints. These aren't self-published books. They're publishing imprints just like, Little Brown or Random House or any of those. But because it's Amazon, a lot of bookstores refuse to initially carry the book in their stores, and so that was a little bit. It made it a little bit of a risk to go with them, but for me, that was the only choice I had, and I was very fortunate to get it when it came along. And they've been great to me, and I really have enjoyed working with them. And what's happening is that, my books have sold well, and the bookstores have come around, and they're carrying my books now, and they're carrying a lot of Thomas & Mercer books because a lot of big-name authors have started to go with them. Patricia Cornwell has a book with Thomas & Mercer. Robert Dugani's a big T&M author. They have Jeffrey Devers, I think, has a book coming out from T&M. So they're continuing to enhance their stable of writers. But the books came out, the first one came out in 2014. Since then, we've sold over 400,000 copies. Really proud of the sales, and the book is, one of the things when you get to this point, it's funny as you think back to what people said at the beginning. Everybody wanted Gone Girl when The Professor came out, and that's why we heard that the book wasn't edgy enough, and it's too old-fashioned, and nobody wants a legal thriller anymore. And so it's very satisfying to me to see now how far we've come. A lot of folks said that only people in Alabama would want to read this book, and really, in Alabama only Alabama football fans, and really amongst Alabama football fans only those that watch the Paul Feinbaum show. And so it's really cool to think that the story has sold 400,000 copies and is now published in Japanese and in Russian, and it's gone a lot farther than Tuscaloosa, and it's really really fun to think about that. Does anybody have a question right now? Yes, sir. Yes, the question is resource material for literary agents, and the sources, and I don't think this has changed much, but the Writer's Market is a big reference book that has lists of agents, lists of editors. I think they now have a book for agents and a book for editors, but for me, it was most important to find the agent first, and so. And then there's another great resource called Jeff Herman's Guide to Literary Agents, Publishers, Editors. I'm probably saying it wrong, but Jeff Herman's Guide, if you Google that, you'll get to it. That book is really good, and it also has interviews with some of the agents where they say what they are looking for and what they don't like. And one of the things you want to do when you're trying to get an agent is you want to make sure that if they want an email, then you don't want to send them a snail mail letter. And if they want, a lot of times they'll say they want, a query letter in the first 10 pages and a synopsis. Well, you want to make sure that you follow their guidelines. But those are the two probably best sources for that. Just for writing in general, Nicholas Sparks, who writes the romance novels, has a great website in terms of help for writers. He has, I think, 4 writers section on his menu in his website, and you can see the query letter that he wrote for the Notebook, which was really fascinating because when he wrote the Notebook, Alzheimer's was really becoming a big deal in the United States, and he focused his query on that for that reason, and he talks about that. And so, of course, the Notebook, and it talks about how he got an agent for the Notebook, and just that whole situation where he went from pharmaceutical rep to, millionaire author in a really short period of time. And so he's very gracious with some of the stuff he shares on there. But that's a good question. Does anybody else have a similar question about anything like that? I was about to go into my process for writing. Everybody's different. I've got everybody has their own habits and times of day when you're most alert. For me, I normally write in the mornings. I'll get up sometime between 4 and 5. It used to be 4. Now I've kind of got like a 7-hour rule where I really try to get 7 hours of sleep because I'm getting older, and I just, it just doesn't do any good to get up and not be able to go. And so I try to get 7 hours of sleep, which normally puts me in the chair at 5. I'll write from 5 to 7, and then I'll go in and do my law job. That was really easy to do when I was just trying to be a writer. Now that I am a writer and have deadlines to meet, it requires a little bit more than that. And so what I try to do is catch flurries. If I'm having a day that I'm in the office at work and it's not real busy, I may take my lunch break and write. Sometimes I'll stay an hour after work to write. And this last book was coming in on deadline, and I was behind. And so I got home from work on Friday, and I spent from Friday at 6 p.m. to Saturday at 6 a.m., nonstop writing. And so, it is a job, just like any other job, and sometimes it's just got to get done. And that's probably one of the things I've learned most about the transition from being somebody who wants to write a story to an author is that the publisher really does expect that book to be done. And now, while the skills that I have learned as a lawyer, particularly in the BS department, have helped me get extensions and stuff like that, at the end of the day, there is a D-Day, and so I've been pretty happy with the first drafts. One thing that does happen is that your first drafts get better. And I do think having some intensity, some time-sensitive intensity, helps, because it helps you make choices, because you do have to make choices if you're going to get to the end. And sometimes you just don't want to make a choice because you know, what if you choose wrong? Well, if you have a deadline or you're determined to get to the end, then you're going to choose one way or the other. You can always fix it. You can always fix a bad choice, but you do have to turn in the product. And so that's the time I write. Now, in terms of how I do it, that's changed a little bit over time. You know, at first, I started with a beginning in mind. Like, I knew I wanted the professor to start at the Waysider restaurant in Tuscaloosa. I wanted Coach Bryant to be there drinking coffee. I wanted Tom to come in. I wanted Coach Bryant to ask Tom to be a law professor at Alabama. I knew that was what I wanted. The ending was a lot more vague and general in my mind. You know, I knew I wanted the story to have a good ending, a positive ending, and I knew kind of how I wanted it to end, but I didn't want to get so tight with my ending that I couldn't have the characters, you know, take off on their own. And so beginning and ending, and then you have your situation in mind. You know, one of the best books I've ever read on the topic of writing is Stephen King's book on writing. I would recommend that and say that it's pretty much required reading for anybody that wants to be a writer. Stephen King is a fascinating writer, person in general. The first part of the book is autobiography and takes you through his life, and then the second half of the book is kind of his toolbox for how to be a writer, and you know, his philosophy, you know, and sort of his mantra that he talks about in that book is read a lot, write a lot. You have to read a lot if you're going to be a writer, and you have to write a lot. And if you don't have time to do those two things, you really don't have time to be a writer. And that was came at a good time for me, you know, because I felt like, you know, I really wasn't reading enough, you know, and reading more books along the lines of what I wanted to write helped me immensely, because I think writing a story is a lot like probably what a songwriter thinks about when he's trying to write a song. You know, there is a beat to a story. And when you're reading a really good novel and you reach the end of a chapter and you turn the page and read the first sentence of the next chapter, there's something that happens where you, as the reader, want to keep turning the pages. Whatever that is, you don't learn it unless you read a lot. And I think that is great advice. And there's so many other great pieces of advice in that book. You know, one of the things he recommends is to try to have a writing goal, you know, and his goal is 2,000 words a day. You know, he said a realistic goal for a new writer is 1,000 words a day, and 1,000 words is what I always try to get to. I don't always get there. You know, a lot of times you write 400 words, and none of them are any good. But as long as you've done it, then I do think that some of those days that aren't good really pave the way for the days that are good. And some days you write 3,500 words, and it's easy as pie. You got tears in your eyes when you finish. You're like, God, look at this. Look at what I've done. And that happens rarely, but a few times it does. And so when it does, it's pretty sweet. And it's a lot sweeter because you know how hard it is. Because you've had those days where you've written 400 pages and you're like, I should really just throw this computer away. And so the process of writing is frustrating, and it really is different for everybody. You know, I don't outline my stories. A lot of folks do. What I do now is I do create sort of a general synopsis where I will write out sort of what I expect to happen. The publisher really does sort of demand that. They kind of want to know what they're getting with the story before they'll buy it. And but as Greg Iles likes to say, you know, he writes a synopsis and then he just basically ignores it when he writes the book. I don't really ignore it. I think it's helpful to have it there just in case. I mean, you're going to have days when you're like, what am I doing? Where is this going? And it's nice to have a little crutch to look at and be like, well, this is what I said I was going to write. Maybe I should go back and look at that. And so it is helpful, I think, for me now to have a synopsis, just to have some type of roadmap for what I want to do. And a lot of times as I'm writing a story, I'll think about a scene that I really want to be in the story. Like, in The Professor, I really wanted there to be some appearance by the members of Tom's 61 team. And so that happens in the trial, and it was important for that to happen. And so I jotted down on a little piece of notebook paper, I want the 61 team to show up at the trial. So I didn't forget it. But I do think if you tie yourself to an outline too tight, then your characters aren't going to be free to do what they want to do. And sometimes when you're writing, your characters really do take off and do something kind of special or different. And that only happens when you are, kind of in the zone, and you've been writing a lot, and you're really into the character and into the story, and all of a sudden it just happens. And I can't really tell you how to do that, but you'll know it when it happens. I didn't have any idea that there was going to be a bulldog that played a real major part of The Professor, but lo and behold, Bo and Tom start talking about dogs, and the next thing I know, there is a storyline in the book that has to do with Tom's dog. And it's one of my favorite storylines, but it wasn't part of my synopsis. So I think you do have to be willing to take a few risks along the way. And I call them dirt roads. If I'm going to Gulf Shores from Huntsville, I'm going to go I-65. But I may want to stop in Clanton and get some peaches, right? And so, you don't have to go straight for the target. A few times you may take a dirt road that might turn out to be something fun, something different, and a subplot that really connects the reader to the character. And so that's what I try to do. When I finish a writing session, I normally will put a few ideas in bold about where I want to go the next day, so that I have some idea when I sit back down of what I want to do. And I really try, especially in the first draft process, to not look too far backwards. You really want to look forwards, because writing a first draft is hard, and you lose a lot of the fun part of it, the making it up as you go, if you're worried that what you've already written isn't good enough. Revising a book is really where the work comes in, and nobody's ever written a great first draft, and so I think the most important thing on the first draft is to write it as fast as you can, get to the end, and hopefully you'll have something that you can go back and fix. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
When it comes to accepting changes a publisher wants,
Mm-hmm.
what's the law? Because you make so many changes, and all of a sudden it's not yours the next day.
Yeah, the editing process is, it's a process. It can be very, helpful, and sometimes it can be painful. My process is that I'll turn in my draft, and then I'll have a developmental editor work with me for about 60 days on concepts within the story, things that he has looked through and seen, and ideas, suggestions, things that seem off to him, things that we could improve, things that he likes. And then he'll send me an editorial letter, and then he'll have some comments in the margin. And, of course, there'll be some just obvious typos and stuff in the story. And then I'll have some time to go back in and make, my edits on his comments. And sometimes I'll agree with him, and sometimes I won't agree. Usually I agree. I'm lucky to have a developmental editor that I really trust, and now I've worked with him now for 4 books. One of the reasons that I'm working with this developmental editor is that in Between Black and White, is a race-related story, and the character of Bo Cephas Haynes, in his dialogue and his background and everything about him, we wanted the tone to be right. And my developmental editor has a background in African American history and studies, and it's just was very helpful to me in writing the scenes in that book, and it's carried forward in the next 2 books. But there are times when you don't agree, I think generally speaking that I've won most of those battles. I think, I was mentioning the crawfish eating contest of The Professor. That was one I really wanted to keep. And I ended up buckling on that, and I'm glad I did. Um, there was, the time frame of these books happens, it's current day, but not quite current day. And the reason for that is that it took me forever to write the books, and I really wanted Billy Neighbors to be in The Professor. And Billy Neighbors died in April of 2012, and so I wanted him to make a cameo in the story. And so I was determined to have my storyline take place in a time frame that he would be alive to make that cameo, because it meant something to me. I'm from Huntsville, and he's from Huntsville, and I coached his grandkid in soccer, and that was really important to me. And I told the publisher that, and they agreed. And so you win some and you lose some. That was important enough to me that it stayed, and it didn't really matter to the storyline, at least from the publisher's standpoint. And so, we won on that one. But you do have battles. I'm in a discussion right now about what the title of book 5 of my story, is going to be. I had the title of the General in mind, because the General is a character in my story. She's the prosecutor in Pulaski, and Bo's going to help her in a big jam in that book. And the publisher's worried that the title is too military sounding, and my character of the General is not in the Army, is not a military person. And so I'm trying to, get my hands on that, and it's tough, because you get attached. It's kind of like, you can't name your son Jimmy Bob. You got to name him something else. And so, I want to name him that, and so it's difficult, but they are the publisher, and they sell a lot of books, and so you don't want to be too stubborn when it comes to that. And so we're trying to find a compromise title that we both like, and that's tough now, because commercial fiction's been around a long time. It's almost impossible to pick a title that hasn't already been used. I did funny thing. My title, The Final Reckoning, was initially going to be called The Reckoning, and just The Reckoning. And it fits my storyline, because Jim Bone Wheeler comes back to get his reckoning from Tom. He says that in the story. Well, about a year before the book was published, John Grisham comes out and announces the title to his new book. Well, we'd already come out with The Reckoning as our title. Well, Grisham says that his book's going to be called The Reckoning, and he has his cover, and it's pretty, and so we're like, well, golly, there's already all these other titles called The Reckoning. Now the biggest author in my genre comes out with the same title. And so in all of our wisdom, we decided to go with The Final Reckoning. So sometimes you do what you have to do. I really like The Final Reckoning title better. It fits my story a little better. So, but it was kind of funny that happened. Yes, ma'am. Right. That's great. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's going the route that you're talking about, which is kind of more of a self-publishing type route, is a lot of folks are doing it now, and some folks are doing it like you are. I mean, very successful at doing it. Like sounds like your first book's been very successful, and that's congratulations. That's awesome. There's a guy that recently died. He's written 15 or 20 legal thrillers, and his name is Scott Pratt. If you look up legal thrillers on Amazon, he's probably got 6 or 7 books in the top 15, and he self-publishes books. And I don't know what his secret is, but he has done a phenomenal job of marketing himself. And what you were saying about publicity, I've been fortunate. With my first publisher, we did not have much publicity behind it, and I really had to go out and do almost all of it myself. And, that involves social media and Facebooking and Twitter and, we're having a website and really trying to put content out there that helps you. I went around and met a lot of bookstore owners through the Southern Independent Booksellers Association, the SIBA. And I was fortunate, Books A Million and Barnes & Noble have been supportive of me in Alabama. And, got the word out, had a bunch of book signings. With my new publisher, Thomas & Mercer, they do a lot of targeting of emails. Like they'll send emails to other purchasers of books on Amazon where they'll say, if you like John Grisham's A Time to Kill, you'll like Robert Bailey's whatever. And, this is a push-button society, and so that has helped me a lot, is, those types of emails. And I do think although I still prefer myself to read real books, I do think that having a digital copy of your book that's only $4 or $5, more people are going to be willing to give you a chance at that, and that's helped me out immensely. And I think the reality of the situation is that most writers, even the big dogs now, are selling most of their novels digitally, through Kindle and Nook and all the different avenues. I mean, that's become the preference of a lot of people in how they read their books. And so that's helpful for new writers because it gives you, I think, a better chance. If somebody's just going into the bookstore and looking at books and they can buy a $25 hardback from Robert Bailey or a $25 hardback from Stephen King and they don't know you at all, then, who are they likely to buy? But if you get an email that says, hey, you want to try Robert Bailey at $4, you might push the button. And so I think it helps you develop a fan base and a readership, so, a brand, so to speak. And, I do think having a traditional publisher, like you were saying, it does help with editing because it's really hard to get it right the first time or even the 10th time. And what's really frustrating is when your book's been developmentally edited and copy edited and proofread and looked at for 5 months to try to get a typo out of there, and then you see one. Or even worse, you have a reader call you on it and say, hey, on page 237, isn't that supposed to be Bo and not Tom? And you look at it and you're like, oh. And that happens. That happens to all of us. In fact, I was reading It by Stephen King back when the movie came out, and I got to page 400 or something, and I saw a typo. He forgot to put a "the" or something in there, and I was like, yes. Just because, even the legends, make mistakes. And so it was very, sometimes you need to see that. Everybody's human, and we're all trying to write the best story we can write. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, the question was when you're writing a query letter to agents, how best can you grab an agent's attention? And you're exactly right. An agent is sitting there getting hundreds of thousands of queries a week, and sometimes the bigger ones get hundreds of thousands of queries a day. And so, what is it about yours that's going to stand out? I think that of everything that I've written, the most important thing that I ever wrote, other than the book itself, was the query letter. My query letter for the professor went through 38 drafts, and I had a lot of folks read it beforehand because when you go out with your novel, I do think it's a good idea to have a few folks read it. I had about 6 or 8 folks read my novel, and not so much for an objective opinion, but I just wanted to see if they liked it. Did you want to keep reading? But the query letter was different. I had hundreds of people read my query letter before I sent it out because, you know, a query is like a back cover. If you look at this, you read the back cover, you have a knee jerk. Do I want to read it or do I not? And you want something that grabs somebody. You want something that resonates, and it can't be. You don't have any time to create that. And so I think the most important thing is, the way I organized mine was a lead paragraph that grabbed, really mostly a sentence or two. A middle paragraph that quickly described the main situation of the plot. And then the last paragraph was, I'm Robert Bailey, and I've been an attorney for 15 years. My book's 115,000 words. I love what you've done with Harlan Coben. Would you please read my book, or would you be interested in reading my book? And then, you hit send and pray. That went through a lot of drafts to get the right tone. And, in the writer's market, they have examples of good query letters and bad query letters. The worst thing you can put on a query letter is, I'm working on this novel that I really think is going to be awesome, and, would you be interested? I mean, they're not even going to look at something that's not done. It's just got to be crisp, and it's got to read like the back cover, and, they're really a lot more interested in the story idea than they are you. And so, unless you're like a former president of the United States, I mean, unless you're like somebody big that everybody knows, most of the time they're interested in the story idea. And the main, whatever it's really about, needs to be captured in a sentence or two. That elevator pitch, like, this is what it is. I think that's what got me the most reads, is the first 2 sentences, And, you want that to sizzle as much as you can. Happy to share my query letter with anybody. If you send me an email on my website, I've got my email address. I'm happy to send you the query letter that I wrote, because I'm proud of it. It took me a long time to get it the way I wanted it, and the first few were terrible. That is a very important part of the process. Yeah. Yeah, when you're writing a series, the question was, when you're writing a series, how do you approach each book? And I think, I think, and other authors may give a different answer on this, but I think it's important that every book you write stand on its own as its own work. And so what I try to do with my stories is create a book that has just enough backstory on the others to where if somebody just picked up The Final Reckoning and started reading it, they could finish it and be okay. I think that's the number one goal I try to achieve with each book, is that it stands on its own. You do worry, though, about repeating similar themes and stuff. And one of the reasons why I ended McMurtry and Drake when I did is I didn't want to do that. I felt like I had a character, that was very much Rocky-like, very much. The redemption theme continues to come up in these stories, and I didn't want Tom McMurtry to ever be handling, a divorce case or a probate case or just something I wanted all of his stories to be epic. Not that you couldn't write a storyline about that and it be good. It didn't fit this character, and so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to end it. I do think some series they get a little bit stale because there's only so many times they can get in the same kind of trouble. Michael Connolly writes the Harry Bosch series, which I think is probably the best series that I've ever read in terms of keeping it fresh. Harry Bosch just keeps coming back, and the things you like about him, one thing you like about series is you get attached to the characters and their mannerisms and their traits. You still feel that warm blanket come over you, but it's always feels fresh. And so I think my main approach is to make the story stand on its own, and I really do try to keep it fresh in terms of what the plot's going to be, and so you don't repeat the same themes over and over again. Anybody else have a question? Yeah.
How do you approach researching? Obviously, how much, I guess, the question, how much personal experiences with your own case, how much research play into your writing?
Yeah, questions how much research plays into my writing process. And so for The Professor, which was a trucking accident case, and I'm a lawyer that's handled trucking cases, I didn't have to do a lot of research. I'd been to Tuscaloosa. I could blindfold myself and get around in Tuscaloosa, and I'd handled that kind of case and had enough trial experience to be able to handle the courtroom scenes without doing a lot of research. Between Black and White is set in Pulaski, Tennessee. It's a criminal case. I'm not a criminal lawyer. It's in Tennessee, not Alabama. And so for that, I did consult with a Tennessee lawyer. I went to Pulaski 5 or 6 times because I wanted to make sure that I didn't say something that was just wrong about the town. I wanted to get kind of a feel for it. So I did a lot more research on that book than I did any other books. Geography is important to my books because most of the places are real, and so I don't want to say something wrong about a particular place. Like, Jasper and Tuscaloosa both play a role in the last trial, and they're connected by the Black Warrior River, which was important in that story in terms of how the crime was committed. And so I wanted to make sure that I could do it that way. I didn't want to have something that just couldn't be done. And so it really is story dependent in terms of research. My 5th book that I'm working on now is going back to Pulaski, and it's another murder mystery story. And so I because I've already researched it once, I feel pretty comfortable with it, but I'm still probably going to go back now that I'm in the editing phase of it and just make sure that I haven't missed anything in the last few years that might be important. I said murder mystery. One of the things that's fun about writing is, the type of book you write. The Professor is a straight-up thriller. It's, who the bad guys are, who the good guys are. It's just how's it going to end, and the mystery is in how it's going to end. Between Black and White and The Last Trial are both whodunit mysteries, and so you want there to be red herrings that you plant throughout the story to confuse and manipulate the reader, which is also fun. And the fun of a murder mystery is that, you can win either way. If the reader figures it out and is satisfied because they did, then you win. If the reader doesn't figure it out and is surprised and they're satisfied because of that, then you still win. And so as long as you entertain along the way, it's a win-win. Of course, you can still have one that they're like, oh, I figured this out in 5 pages. It's real predictable. I mean, that would be the negative of writing one of those books, is there is a chance somebody might say that. And so stepping out there for me was writing a murder mystery because I hadn't written one before, but I really enjoy both of them. And the 5th book I'm writing is more of a whodunit. And so it's nice to be able to switch, too, because you don't want to get so tied to one type of story that you can't write something else. One of the most fun things that I've done since I started this is I've written a completely different book that I've sent to my agent last month called The Golfer's Carol. And it's a sports fable about a golfer that's a lawyer, and he's contemplating suicide, and he's visited by these ghosts. And I don't know if it's going to be good or not, but it's completely different than anything I've ever written before. And so it was really fun to write that after the Final Reckoning, because it gave me a different, outlet. It's something I've always wanted to do. And so when I came back to the legal thriller, it was, I don't know, it just felt fresher. So I think the most important thing is just to keep writing, keep reading. Does anybody else have a question? Yes. Well, I think that it is important to, when you're writing a series, to have kind of a character that, that resonates, that people want to keep reading about. And so to do that, you do have to kind of brand that character with some characteristics that continue to play out, during the stories. I think that, Harry Bosch likes to listen to jazz music, and, he lives in that neat house in California that looks out over the cliff, and that's a part of every one of his books, is some scene where he's looking out over, Los Angeles. And so I think that it is important to have some similarities, because that's why a lot of your readers are coming back. But I do feel like that in terms of plot, in terms of what the story's going to be about, you want to try to keep it fresh and not just keep writing the same story over and over again. They did want a second book, yes, and I understand what you're asking now. She wanted to know, did my publisher expect a second book, when I turned in The Professor, and they did, and that was a challenge for me, because I had written The Professor as sort of a one-off story, and I really didn't envision it as a series to begin with, because my character was older, and I didn't think that there would be a lot of books that I could write. There is a certain clock that is ticking on all of us, and I just didn't feel like I had, a whole lot of stories I could write about him. I did have one, though. I had Between Black and White, and I had already written it, and so, I was able to put Tom in that story, and it really made the story much better. And so what happens to me a lot of times is, as I'm writing one story, I'll start thinking about the idea for the next one. And so we were able to sell the idea to The Last Trial while we were editing Between Black and White. And so, and then same thing with The Final Reckoning. And lucky enough, with that book, they went ahead and bought the first book in this new series. And so it did become a series, but it really wasn't necessarily intended to be that. It was, in some ways, publisher-driven. So, yeah. Yes, we did that with the character in The Last Trial that comes back and is really the main plot mover of that story. Is a character that we had her doing something at the very end of The Professor that was going to be a big surprise, kind of melodramatic finish to that story, and I really liked it. A lot of my beta readers liked it too. The publisher thought it took away from Tom's ending, and so we decided to cut it. But the publisher said, this is good, and we like the idea of this character coming back, and so you need to keep that in your back pocket. Well, I did, and it became the idea for book 3. So that happens a lot, actually. It definitely happened to me. And sometimes, even now, when you write an 850-page monster, obviously you cut a whole lot, and sometimes I think I'm about to write a scene that I cut from a previous book, and I'll go back and look at it just to see, how did I do this 3 years ago, and so it, that is helpful. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think within the thriller genre, probably between 80,000 and 90,000 words is probably spot on. Even at 450 pages, 420 pages, I can't remember what we sent out, but it was about 120,000 words. It was still a little long, which ended up getting cut down. I think you can be a little long, you just can't be a lot long. I think it is helpful to be in the wheelhouse because they normally will ask the word length to be included in the query letter. And I think what happened to me is they saw 200,000 words and they just didn't even read the query. That's why I got the quick rejections. So, and now it may be different for other genres. Like this golf book I was telling about. This golf fable is only 60,000 words. It's very much kind of like Tuesdays with Morrie, a book by Mitch Albom. It's kind of a shorter book. It's got a more simple storyline, and so I figured it probably needed to be a little shorter. But the easiest way to learn that is to look at people that are selling a lot of books are normally right on that line. James Patterson sells a bunch of books. Almost all of them are about 350 pages, and so now not everyone plays by the rules. Stephen King doesn't play by the rules, and everything he writes sells because he's fantastic. Greg Iles has written some really long books too, but for the most part, even the big dogs, will stick to kind of, because most storylines play out, around that length. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have William Bernhard. Is that Kincaid? Ben Kincaid, yes. William Bernhard has been really good to me. He gave me a blurb for The Professor, and he is a good writer and a good guy. He was real helpful to me as a trying to get published author. He was one of the other authors that gave me a blurb. Yeah, I like him. Yeah. Do you have to be? No. Well, that's called an advance, and most publishing companies will give some type of advance to a writer. You hear the big dogs, get these monster advances. Like, I don't know what Michelle got, but I would think it'd probably be in the millions. Nicholas Sparks got $1 million for The Notebook. That's the exception, not the norm. Most people probably get some type of advance between a couple $1,000s and 25, depending on the story. I don't really know what the Baldaccis of the world get when they don't really release the advance information for a lot of those guys, but they get some type of advance. And what happens is, let's say you get a $10,000 advance. Well, then they give you that up front, and your agent takes her 15%, and so you get 8,500 of it. And but 10,000 is what the advance is, and then you start getting royalties because hopefully people start buying the book. And for me, I get 35% off my digital sales, and I get 10% off the hard sales, and so which equals about the same. People ask me, "What's better for you, Bob?" My friends do. Is it better to buy this hardback or this trade paperback, or is it better to buy digital? And I'm like, it really doesn't matter. It's about the same. But what happens is I get a little percentage of each of those sales, and when that percentage extends beyond $10,000, then I start collecting royalties, and that's called earning out your advance. Yeah. Right, and publishers are different in terms of what they give on royalties, but generally speaking, if you're an author, you want to earn out your advance because you've made the publisher some money at that point, and you're more likely to get another book offer if you've earned out your advance. And so it's great to get the big advance, but if you do and you don't earn out or don't even come close to earning out, then it's going to be harder to have a career, to have another book published after that. So it's kind of a catch-22. It's if you get a smaller one and earn it out, then hopefully the next one's a little bigger, and it goes like that.
Well, we have time for one last question. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I read a lot of different stuff. This is my friend Patrick Sadler. We went to high school together, so good dude. I'm reading right now a book by James Lee Burke, which would be in the genre of what I write, and he's one of the masters. I think it's called Black Cherry Blues, but it's very good. I think, yes. It's one of the early Robichaux books, and all of those are so good. That character is so well drawn. If you ever want to just read books about how to create an incredible series, the James Lee Burke Robichaux series is fantastic. But that's what I'm reading right now. Trying to think, I read something right before that was good, but it escapes me. But I try to keep a book in my hand. The last Stephen King book I read that I really loved was 11/22/63. I highly recommend that one. It's a long one, but it is really good. I read a little bit of everything. So, good question.
All right. Well, everybody, let's thank Robert for coming here today.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. It's fun.